Well, here we are, week 15, final engagement of the course and my final reflection to you on your posts. It's been a really great, awesome experience to watch your growth through the last 15 weeks. I think a lot of you came in really having some idea about what STEM was and career and technical education. But as some of you have commented, and I really hope this was a takeaway of the course, you have now made some connections or thoughts about being more explicit. You have the perfect vehicle in career and technical education to be explicit about the standards that we want students to know related to STEM. And I want to just take one more moment while we're talking about that. We spent so much time looking at the next generation science standards. We put those into context with our project-based learning. But that T and that E, we had a whole week on that, and I just want to make sure that that doesn't get ignored. While that NGSS has some good engineering practices and the core disciplinary ideas, I do still feel like they're a little bit soft in the application, the technical part, in terms of the actual standard. It's almost like a little bit of lip service. And that is the part where we can really come in, we, meaning career and technical educators, can come in and contextualize the science, the engineering, and the math with the technology. Even if the standard isn't quite as explicit as we'd like it to be working with technology. I mean, there is very little in the NGSS related to computer science, computer engineering, and some of the technical fields that some of you work with. And that doesn't mean that you're not doing STEM. It just means that in the STEM part of NGSS, they were a little bit lax in putting that in. Maybe that's by design. Maybe that left that really nice niche for integrating those STEM disciplines, the specific academic disciplines with career and technical education. So I encourage you to look for those places where you can be explicit about the science, the technology, the engineering, and the math through your own content. And not every single thing will fit. But I do believe that for the most part, you are working in a discipline that relates to STEM abilities, STEM careers, and at the very bare minimum, STEM literacy. Okay, let's take a look at these questions. I had a little bit of fun maybe this week making the videos about misconceptions and socioscience and pseudoscience. I just want to make sure for review here you understand the difference of what we're looking at. Socioscience are real issues that we need to take a look at. I held up the beach ball and said, you know, you may have a valid look at that beach ball or that issue from different points of view. They may very well, in those different points of view, have some very compelling evidence. It may not always be science evidence. It could be economic or cultural evidence that they have, historical evidence, and it doesn't mean we discount the argument. But pseudoscience is that scientific argument that's coming from that one point of view, or maybe another point of view, that isn't based on science. It's not the economics. It's not the historical facts. It's not the cultural kind of fact. It is literally pseudoscience. So I hope, and based on your post this week, I think most of you captured the difference. And it was really fun to read through, and I'm using the awesome screenshot, and there might be a little backtracking back and forth here, but I really wanted to highlight some of the things that you said related to the misconceptions. Before I get too far, that's on question 2. Question 1, you were asked to share any information communication tool that you might be aware of to help with quizzing and understanding vocabulary. Thanks to all of you who shared a resource. I'm going to go check those out and put them someplace in my wiki to where they might fit better in a couple of different categories. So thanks for sharing. And those of you who have read their posts, I encourage you to go check some of these out. But there are so many applications and so much software out there that just, this is sometimes the best way to learn about it is somebody who has used it previously in the application that we're talking about. So enough on question 1 then. Question 2, I think this was a question about the evidence to claim, which type of evidence to a claim is more susceptible to misconception, reasoning or inference? And nearly all of you said inference. And there were some very good supportive reasons. I want to talk about those as I scroll down through here. And then many of you also added on here on question 3 about the pseudoscience and misconceptions. And that's where you really all got to get on a bit of a soapbox and go on about the things that really drive you crazy, that have no basis in science, and just get out there and get spun out of control. That was really fun to read. And then, of course, we'll tie up here some loose ends with the instructional strategies that some of you suggested, and I'll add one of my own. So on question 2, most of you agreed that inference was a problem, and a scroll down because I think that Amelia had a really really good definition, as did Jean and a few others, about why. And that's what I was really looking for. When you responded to this question, I was looking for you to support your opinion or your response to this question with some evidence. And so a lot of you went back to the text and really pulled out the definitions. And Amelia said this, and this was pretty much dead on. I believe that inference is more susceptible to a misconception. Reasoning should be based on evidence, which by definition means it comes out of something that is trusted, whereas inference comes from an observation, which may or may not have been fully visible. Reasoning seems to have a stronger connection to evidence or fact-based material than inference. And I think that that's probably the big takeaway from the readings that you had this week. So even though it's an important skill for people to be able to infer, reasoning related to logic, and I look at the actual evidence, so you're building it on a stronger foundation than just what you observe, is probably a more factual way to base a claim. The third question here about misconceptions, she went off and talked a little bit about genetically engineering foods in particular. And this was actually a topic that I thought about waxing on about in my presentation or overview for this week. But because this is my area, agriculture, and it is real, we have a lot of issues related to production practices and what gets kind of spun out of control and what the science may or may not be behind a particular issue. But I chose to focus on something I consider that consumer part, the STEM literacy part, looking at the electricity and the nutritional supplements, of which I think nearly every, if not every family in consumer science person in this course talked about. Katie and Lois and Kate and gluten, and they all had something they wanted to say about that. Great. Those are the things that bother you. Those are the things where you can make a difference. And then, of course, Amelia, with her ag background, it goes back to the production systems, and oftentimes agriculture gets blamed for producing wheat that is not like it used to be, and it's because of all the GMOs, and it's because of so many of the different types of science technologies that we've put toward that product to make it, quite honestly, stretch more. People like a stretchy pizza crust. Going back and talking about that product, so she was able to chime in on that one as well. So it was really good to read the comments then about your misconceptions and the reasoning and inference. As I mentioned, most of you went on and said inference for the reasons that Amelia so eloquently placed right there. I'm going to come back, I think, to question 4. Let me make sure there's nothing else on question 2. Corey talked about the educational guess based on personal thoughts and experiences, as those were linked to inference. Very good. That's also some of the substantiated part of the article. What is it we're really looking at when reasoning is really all about that logic? He pulled out some things that kind of make him a little bit crazy, which is nuclear energy and electric cars, and truly looking at how they impact the environment. And there's a lot of a spin. And my husband's an electrical engineer, and he has definite opinions about nuclear energy and the misconceptions around that. So I'm very familiar with that argument, as I am with electric cars and their so-called environmental friendliness in the way that they are actually currently made, and the way that we currently get electricity. Not saying technologies can't change in the future, but sometimes these carte blanche statements oftentimes have a yeah, but. I think also Jean talked about that as well. There's a site that Russ shared, the Trello site. And then keep going here on question 3. I just want to make sure I capture all the important items there, questions 2 and 3. Here we go. So here's Jean's comments about magnetic fuel savers and the life of the engine. He also talked about some things that go out on Facebook that, you know, well, if you just add a cup of coolant or a cup of oil, you know, things will be better. And in this case, he's talking about these fuel savers and additives to the oil. And he says, if these additives work so well and increase the life of the engine, why wouldn't an OEM use this additive in engines from the start? Now, that is a really good statement to make about any type of scientific claim. If this is so good, why hasn't medical science already done it? If this is so good, why haven't engineers already done it? If this is so good, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that oftentimes what you'll hear from people who don't have some good scientific evidence is that there's some sort of conspiracy that maybe the automakers want you to have this. or the AMA, the doctors group, doesn't want you to have this, or the USDA doesn't want you to have this. There's oftentimes some sort of conspiracy. As soon as you hear that, and maybe there is, not saying that there might be not some collusion going on. It's not past the purview of history to say that there hasn't been collusion, but it raises a red flag for you to go and say, is there really a conspiracy, or is this just somebody's way of selling me something that I don't really need, and for them to make a profit off it? So I think that that is a really important statement when you look at, if this is so good, why don't? And they don't have a good response for you. I really kind of chuckled when I read Cameron's post, because he talks about his wife buying a Kirby vacuum in their marriage, and he realized after this whole presentation, and then they purchased this thing, that they could have bought a Dyson every year for the past 8 years for what they spent on the stupid vacuum. And one of my questions, I was wondering, he still called her his wife, not his ex-wife. They're still married. But this is sometimes what happens when we might be caught in the heat of the moment from a sales pitch. And in fact, one of the things that I tell folks in a sales pitch, that if they are forcing you to make a decision right then, is probably a bad decision to make. If they can't wait to give you time to do research, then it's a bad decision to make right there. That tells you a lot about the person that you're working with and what their true goals might be. So anyway, I gave that a quick chuckle. Amelia talks about misconceptions about antibiotics, and she went in here a little bit different. She was responding to this post up here from Kate about high school and adult students willing to research articles. Did you think there was a maturity or a developmental level where some students, older students, are more likely to go do their own research and that sort of thing? And I would say developmentally, yeah, I think we become more questioning as we get older. We have to encourage that questioning. I think sometimes we're so in the pattern with children and youth that we say, you're doing that because I say you're doing it. And we actually kind of start them thinking that way very early on. And then all of a sudden we ask them to think critically or solve a problem, and we wonder why they can't do it. And oftentimes it's that they haven't been groomed to ask questions. Now, truly, there's that 3 or 4 year old that keeps asking you why, and finally you get tired of it and you say, because I said so. But I'm actually of the idea of, this is why, and that's enough. And so I think that sometimes they've just had some bad modeling and not been encouraged to ask questions. And so we find that it takes a long time for them to make that transition into that critical thinker and that problem solver. And it's oftentimes even into their 30s or 40s. And by then they haven't got the skills, the research skills really, to filter out fact from fiction, inference from reasoning, from evidence, and all of those kinds of things that we talked about this week. And then they start to mix that up with the pseudoscience and the socioscience, which really has some possible point of view on a particular issue, and that's where it gets pretty darn messy. One of the things that was talked about both by Russ and by Amy this week is about what qualifies as a STEM career and what type of education you have, and that this has been a misconception. And Russ, way up on the top, and I can scroll back up there in a minute, talks about, that's something that he really struggled with, was that he was feeling like we needed to make the CTE STEM. And I hope that you really now got contextualizing STEM in CTE. We're not going to get it all. We're not going to say we do it all, but we are going to say we do a pretty darn good job at career and technical fields, and that there are a lot of middle level, and we prepare them to think about higher level jobs related to STEM. And at the very least, as I've mentioned before, we can really, really be explicit about those STEM literacy connections by getting them to think critically in those 4C kinds of things, right, for what we were talking about this week related to pseudoscience and socioscience. So I think that's a really important takeaway, and I hope that you all got to that point. Lois had a good post about essential oils. I've had lots of calls on those, and provided a website for, is this really fact or fiction? And by the way, there are quite a few good fact checker sites now. Google's starting their own fact checker site. This area of fake news, I think I shared those in my overview. It's good to do research, but look at the credibility of the research. Look at, as I mentioned from that beach ball activity, what makes a credible author? Is it the sample size large enough? Did they do a double-blind trial? Is it just anecdotal? Is it just one person? Is it just a case study? Those are the sorts of things we have to think critically about. Now, this is question 4, and I want to come back up to the top. And that question 4 was about the instructional strategies. Let's scroll down through here. Oh, I did highlight this one item here. I mentioned in my overview the Pacific Northwest tree octopus, and it was really fun here to click on this link that Amelia posted about the Michigan's fresh Great Lakes whale watching. And she's right. The Great Lakes do look like ocean. I go there at least every other year, and every time I'm like, wow, it really could be the ocean. And so there is some tomfoolery or you know, I don't. So there is some misconception and tomfoolery and that kind of thing around the Great Lakes whale watching. I also saw the link underneath about sharks in there. That was really interesting. On the 4th question, then, we'll start back here, and I want to address just this last question about instructional strategies for dealing with socioscience and pseudoscience. Socioscience, I talked about different points of view and validating those and really looking at there's evidence within the history, the culture, the economy, not just discounting those altogether. And of course, there's the scientific evidence. Those are 4, there may be others, really important viewpoints when we're looking at an issue. But on this idea of misconceptions and sources and credible sources, that I shared as well with the beach ball example of things that make what might make it credible, the author doing all of those things that you need to look at for making it legitimate. But she says one of the things that they do for a contest that they run with FFA students in Michigan is to pick out all the misconceptions or pseudosciences in a conversation. In other words, they have to listen very closely and determine if somebody's just making an opinion, and if they are, is there any ways to substantiate that with any kind of evidence? And so it's like listening to text or listening to spiel or video, whatever it might be, and then trying to pick out those things that may need further research. I think that that's a really good way to think critically about these statements. And then look for credible sources for each one of those statements, and that does definitely tie into a 21st century skills. So picking apart statements, that's a good way to take a look at it. Looking at those fact checker sites, that's another good way to say it. And Amy's commenting about the whale watching site. Keep going down here, questioning techniques. This is Corey. He talks about using these important to use questioning techniques to keep going further and further and further, even if you know the answer. You're kind of setting them up a little bit, and that's okay. Get them to think critically. And actually, one of the nice things about this is that you don't have to give away what the answer is. You can be as innocent in the way that you present these questions. And that's another thing that down here a little further, Lois talks about, is making sure that you have the right tone. This is from Russ. He says he's on a presentation video making kick right now. So in his case, he's probably making these so they can go online in a web way and doing it it'll be broadcast or spamming everybody via email or social networks. And so he's saying one of the things that he can maybe think about is that people tell the story or get the evidence and make sure it's supported and make accurate videos. And the students would be, that would be the kind of the demonstration, if you will, of them understanding a particular issue or addressing a particular misconception. One of these, this is a great quote, and I think Amy highlighted it later. Russ said, Facebook is a feeding ground for inference. That's right. And you have to really take with a grain of salt what you might read there. Lois comments also on questioning, and she says one of the things that she is aware of is tone. She said, I heard a woman say, will you please help me understand what you mean, to a man when he told her about a remedy of some kind. She wanted to know more, wanted to know how he came to think what he did about that product. Her nonverbal communication was positive and patient. She listened and asked him to listen to her where she had proven information from reliable sources to dispel any misconceptions. Her instructional strategy was even temperament, not getting all wound up and just presenting the facts and doing that in an unemotional way. I think it's not just the presentation of those facts, but the asking of those questions that are without a true agenda for having somebody explain to you why they feel that way, and not always looking for confirmation bias of your own opinion or discounting it. In other words, you're going to let them talk, but it's not really going into your ears. It's just one of that background sound. I think a lot of you know what it is. Maybe it's these videos. But that's the sort of thing that's really important with questioning, is real communication. That means not just speaking, but that means listening. And when you're listening and speaking, there's that tone thing of what's coming across. Cameron also added on to that, and he said most people are so emotionally driven that a very innocent comment, question, or teaching can be misconstrued as an insult. So again, that tone is really important. Questioning as a technique for ferreting out these misconceptions, pseudoscience, if you will. This is Katie, and she says it's really time to let the students do some research. And I think that's a good idea for them to have their own investigation, ask their own questions. But I would add this one little caveat in that make sure that you guide them in what is really good evidence, or what are some factual places they can go. And obviously Facebook is probably not one of those places. So making sure that they understand what is considered a credible source. What else? And I'll make some other comments back to some of you individually. I think that may be about it on the questioning. Yes, and there's Cameron's last comment. And he says one of the things they do for root cause and analysis of accidents is to go to the problem, get it corrected by applying a similar system of questioning and questioning statistics that students gather to help triangulate what exactly went on. And so again, questioning and looking for evidence, it's almost detective work. So that was one of the ways I wanted to share with you that I would approach these types of issues. One is as a detective. There's a lot of different lessons I've seen that they're using kind of this idea of forensic science. Find the evidence. What in this forensic situation, or you walk into it's almost like the game of Clue. You walk in and you see this happening. You're making some inferences. Are you doing some reasoning, or are you going to actually look for evidence and present a case of what you think happened? And that's related to my next strategy, which is debate. Hold a debate. Give folks two sides of an issue, maybe more, and construct some sort of debate. You don't have to have it with a really strict rules that you might see in high school debate, but you can make your own. And you can also set up as a legislative forum, or like a parliamentary procedure where people are making arguments on a particular topic, but have them have a debate where they can talk about it and question one another and have rebuttals. And that's sometimes a good way to get to the bottom of something like perhaps gluten. All right, those are my comments for week 15. Great job, everybody. It's been really great to watch your progression through the course this semester and watch your growth in all of these areas. I hope that some of the content that we've covered this year will really help you in your career and as you move forward in current technical education, both in your teaching and hopefully as true leaders in the area of career and technical education.